All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the annual AIA Austin Homes Tour. My name is Pooja Shetty, and I will be your moderator for the hour. In a few minutes, we will take a look at the Inverse House by Matt Fajkus Architecture, which some of you may have seen on tour yesterday. But first, I want to take some time to thank the sponsors for this event. First, we have Dalgleish Construction Company. We have David Wilson Garden Design, Foursquare Builders, Reisinger Build, and Urban Space. As our underwriters, we have Indoor Weather Professionals and Melds Construction Company. Gold sponsors, we have Austin Iron, Bryant Heating and Cooling Systems, and Lindsay Hanna Design. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Our presenters today are Matt Fajkus and Sarah Johnson, principal architects of Matt Fajkus Architecture, also known as MF Architecture. The practice was founded in 2011 and has over 90 completed residential, commercial, and installation projects across Austin and Texas. MF Architecture has been recognized locally and nationally by different publications and organizations such as the Wall Street Journal, Dwell Magazine, National Public Radio, Texas Society of Architects, and the American Institute of Architects. Practice was awarded the 2019 AIA National Design Award for the Westlake Dermatology Marble Falls Medical Office Building. Matt Fajkus is a native of Austin and holds a Master of Architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's also a tenured associate professor at the University of Texas School of Architecture, where he teaches studio design courses, as well as courses in sustainable design. Matt was the winner of AIA Austin's Emerging Professional Achievement Honor Award, as well as several awards for teaching excellence. Matt is also the co-author of a book titled Architectural Science and the Sun. Sarah Johnson has bachelor's degrees in both architecture and civil engineering and received her Master of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin. She was MF Architecture's first employee and has worked with Matt to build a strong collaborative design team over the last 10 years. Sarah is a finalist for this year's Austin Under 40 Awards in the Architecture and Engineering category. This year's house, Inverse House, is the third home that MF Architecture has showcased on the AIA Austin Homes Tour. Welcome, Matt and Sarah.
Hi, Pooja. Thanks for having us.
It's great to have you all here again.
All right, should we take the floor?
Take it away.
So let's go ahead and share screen here. And we first want to, in addition to what Pooja very eloquently stated, we want to emphasize the sponsors, not only as sponsors that are helping to underwrite this, but also as collaborators that really make the whole projects happen in the first place. And so we do want to thank very directly and emphasize again the underwriters of Melody Construction and the Indoor Weather Professionals, as well as Bryant Heating and Cooling and Austin Iron. And really to our entire team, including our clients. And so with Melody as the GC and Lindsay Hanna Design, working carefully through a lot of the different interiors and styling, as well as our clients, Chris and Leah Petrie, who are all wonderful to work with. And this project is completely derived from that collaboration, and it's better. We're all better than the sum of our parts through all of that. And so we wanted to go out of our way to emphasize that and recognize that this has completely been a team effort, and we're very proud to be part of that team and feel very fortunate to be part of this tour in general. So we are going to try to toggle over to our video. And we're going to share a video that's about 20 minutes in length, and then we'll field Q&A after that. So let's see if we can get that going.
So if you have any questions while you're watching this video, go ahead and throw them in the chat and Q&A, and we'll try to get to everybody after the video.
Hello, we're MF Architecture, and we will present the Inverse House to you. And we'd like to first introduce ourselves briefly. First off, Sarah Johnson is principal architect at MF Architecture and has been with the practice really since the outset about a decade ago, and is a very critical part of all of our projects. both from the design front and as well as the delivery and all the things that have to do with that.
Matt Fajkus is, of course, principal architect here at MF Architecture and founding principal. But he also teaches at UT full-time, and a lot of his academic coursework is around light and architecture. And so we naturally bring that into our office, and that is a big theme in a lot of our work.
Physically, our office is on East 6th Street, very close to downtown. And we operate as a collaborative, both internally as well as with others. And that's a big part of the way that we develop our work. We've been fortunate to be involved in many different types of projects over the years of different typologies, and have been fortunate to gain traction with those projects to be able to develop and build as we go in terms of testing different ideas, and whether it has to do with rethinking what a medical office building might be so that we can remove the stigma of going to the doctor, or thinking about an urban infill house or an office. In every case, we're always thinking about typology in very meaningful ways, and that applies to each house that we design, where we're bringing it back to fundamentals of thinking about form, thinking about function, and the different apertures and openings that allow for natural light to enter the house, allow for direct and indirect connection to the outdoors. Those are themes that pervade throughout our work, and we've been fortunate to have multiple houses of ours on the AIA Homes tours in the past, including a few that we're showing here, and some of these will be in future homes tours, hopefully as well. Much of our work has to do with coming back to thinking about functionalism in a very meaningful way. So functionalism, both in terms of the program of a given house and how it flows and how it works together, but then also how it relates to its site. And so we think a lot about how we engage with the given context in a site, whether it has to do with slope and trees and breezes, solar orientation, all of those factors come into play. And we're simultaneously thinking about both a top-down logic and a bottom-up logic. And when we talk about a top-down logic, we're talking about really a higher order or an overall organizational logic that helps us compose an overall design, while simultaneously thinking about a bottom-up logic, which has to do with a vignette or a single human experience. And just before I go on, I'll mention that part of what we'll do here is to give a little bit of a broader context to explain how we think in our philosophy toward architecture before diving into the inverse house specifically. Just as an example of this top-down and bottom-up logic, a house that we designed called the Descendant House is very much rooted in its site and masked in a way. The volumes of the house are all organized and designed with a very clear material logic that one can understand in terms of its overall site strategy, but then pays dividends, and one can understand that in terms of the experience within the house. These things don't happen by chance. They're all to do, each of these moments in vignettes that come from a very clear way to approach the site, approach form and materiality, and how all of those things come together. These are notions that go back in architecture. Le Corbusier was a 20th century master who worked with light in many different ways. And part of that was stepping back to think about how architecture was a container to be able to modulate light, and sometimes to create ambient light that was more dispersed over a space, and other times to create very specific punctures and create sacred light, as it were. And this is something that that we think about a fair amount when we think about apertures and openings. This again is still the work of Le Corbusier, but when we think about apertures and openings and how those both illuminate a space functionally, but then also create a certain type of experience or feeling, but then also how architecture can receive shadows and become a canvas to embrace something beyond itself. So in other words, instead of having ornament on this facade is designed to be able to receive shadows and change throughout the day. This can be seen in the work of other architects that even practice in the contemporary world, including Stephen Hall architects, where in this case, an MIT dorm building is thought of in terms of an overall container that has very specific openings, sometimes unpredictable ones or unexpected ones that allow light deep into the space and celebrate in that respect, in addition to openings and punctures in the facade. Louis Kahn is an architect that was also a 20th century master who worked in a similar vein of thinking very much about how architecture is composed in a way to modulate light and as much as it is about enabling function and program within. And therefore, in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, for example, the permanent collection can be seen literally in a different light every day of the year and throughout the seasons. So this is something that we're thinking about quite carefully. And this goes back, this is a notion that goes back even further. If we take this back to Rome, and if we think of the Pantheon from 125 AD, where the idea was both in an urban sense to think about solid and void, and so with Piazza Navona or the Pantheon itself, which is an enclosed building, but that void is very much thinking about all the spaces that are adjacent to it within the city. But then this one oculus, this one aperture in the top of the dome is something that has a very specific effect internally. So it is at once, it is this top-down overall layout where it's thought about in terms of a higher order, but not just to follow the rules in terms of an urban master plan, but also very much about the human experience within that and creating a very direct relationship to light. This, of course, occurs also in nature. Much of the way that nature manages and modulates and dapples light has to do with different types of flow that have occurred over the years, whether it's flows of water, erosion from the wind, and all of those types of things that don't happen by chance, but that have a very specific effect due to this type of crafting and carving. This begins to relate to this notion of tectonic and a stereotomic approach. So a tectonic approach is the way that we typically think of construction, which is adding up a bunch of little pieces and building them together and assembling them. But sometimes we also think about design from a stereotomic approach, where we're thinking about design by subtraction or by carving into something. And this is one way that we will think about allowing natural light into a space. We think about an overall house, as it were, as a solid object, and we think, how can we make very intentional openings that perhaps go deeper than just a punched opening, a punched window on the facade, to illuminate spaces, sometimes in unpredictable, but always meaningful ways. Now, all of those things are not just for stylistic effect. You know, when we think about introducing light into spaces, there are very direct ways that this impacts the human body in terms of health, the capacity to learn and work. And our circadian rhythms are very much dependent upon our relationship to natural light. And architecture runs a risk, or buildings that run a risk of, when trying to keep all the things that we don't like about nature out, because architecture is about shelter, of course, sometimes we can push away all the good things about nature as well. And so we want to find ways, and this being a glimpse into the inverse house on the AI Homes tour, to think about how can we celebrate and very intentionally create moments to be able to connect to the outdoors, whether that has to do with a long prospect view or a short view, or even just a view to the sky to connect to something more vast. How can a house transcend just being a place that's a collection of rooms and become something more? So Sarah will elaborate more on the inverse house itself.
So the inverse house gave us a really unique opportunity to think about, a place for living, a place for light, and also a unique program and siting approach that presented kind of an inverse functionality and need for living. This is within an older subdivision. And so this is set up in a series of kind of row home configurations. So we were working initially with some requirements that required some very solid walls, and that gives privacy for neighbors. Also very long, narrow projects. And so we initially thought about how do we bring light into this space with these constraints. Also, we were dealing with a project that was had two public facades, or had two kind of entry and action points. And so we had, of course, the regular entry where you park your car and you enter, or you receive guests, but also an entry where, or a face that would be exposed to the public realm of a golf course. And so we're also receiving guests and activity from that dimension as well. So in a lot of ways, we're thinking about how we pull light through this building, how we pull people through this building, how we work with a very narrow site and a very narrow building with very solid walls. And so we began to use some of those principles that Matt was describing, and thinking about unique ways that we could bring light in from above or capture it within the sides of the building. So this is the approach to the building. This is the proper entry, or the garage and the front door. And so this is where you would receive most of your guests and the owners into their home on a daily basis. And you'll notice that it's quite low. It's fairly unassuming, its presence within this kind of neighborhood context. And sectionally, you've seen how this begins to then open up dramatically to the back. But this allows us, you can see here from the front facade, we're beginning to see those notions of ways that we can pop up and bring light into the space. This is the entry. Once you proceed through the front door, you're immediately provided this view. There's something beyond. There's that notion of something in the back, something that pulls you in, as well as light flooding from above from those clear story windows we saw in the front, and then these high windows on the side. So here to our right is one of those solid walls, and we had to be very careful about how we punctured that, knowing that there's a neighbor, 5 feet away. And so this allowed this opportunity for a view to the sky instead of a view to the building next door. Another way that this house is inversed is that we begin to play with both sectionally where the public and the private space happens. I think traditionally in a normal suburban home, you would imagine that the public spaces would be on the ground level and the private spaces would be up above. Here you actually enter into the private space and flow through to a public space, and then we tuck the private spaces below as the grade drops. This is the owner suite, so it's on the primary level, and it's just as you enter the front door. So we're here, the front door was around this area. So we tuck this master suite really into the middle of this house. And this could really be the darkest, dungiest place of the entire project, but we've looked at ways to bring light in through this clear story window. Again, that's something we saw from the front, but also we begin to carve out of this building. We leave the exterior wall here for privacy from the neighbors, of course, but we begin to pull that conditioned space back to create a place to occupy physically outside, but also a place to allow light into these rooms. Here are just some photos of that in kind of different times of day and seeing that light rake in. Here the primary light is coming from that clear story rather than the courtyard adjacent. This is taken from within the owner's bathroom, which occupies the other end of this little pocket garden. Again, just really dissolving that interior and exterior space and making those flow seamlessly, and those shadows just dance through the glass into the interior space. This is another view of that courtyard looking into that owner's bathroom. You can see the materials, but also the light is just allowed to flow into that space. This is standing from within the owner's restroom looking into the shower. And so we begin to bring light in from above and to the side. And there are different moments within this project where you actually cannot see the source of light. You just notice this, you experience this feeling of light and airiness, and you don't really know where it's coming from. You don't really have the sense that you're buried within the middle of this floor plan because there are these unexpected ways to receive light. As you transition past the owner suite, which, like I said, was in the middle of this plan, you now enter into the public realm of the kitchen, living, dining. Here we open up sectionally the most to really bring in the view of the golf course and of the surrounding hill country. It's also the place where we have to deal with the most light intake. And so we have different fenestration on the exterior of the building that begins to modulate that light throughout the day. But really this room is a canvas for daylight. And it's something that we noticed throughout the entire construction process, as different seasons would happen in different times of day. Just to see that light dance around this room was an incredible experience. This is a close-up image of the fireplace detail. And again, just to see how these very neutral materials of drywall and stucco begin to receive these shadows and begin to become art themselves that's highlighted different throughout the day and throughout different seasons. The kitchen we tuck in with some millwork to create some groundness for that area, but really it exists within this open space. And again, this view just captures opening up onto that golf course below, but also the sense that you're in the most public part of the house, but you're also at the level of the tree canopies. That's typically unexpected. That's something you might experience in a bedroom of a normal house, but here we're actually in that public space sectionally. As we transcend down to the lowest level, to the basement, we, again, on the left, we have our other solid wall, kind of our row house HOA restraint. And, you know, instead of just having this long, dark corridor, we begin to then open up the roof here to bring in light. And again, this shadow plays on this wall and becomes a piece of art itself throughout the day. And it leads you down to that lower level, which again, you might, immediately think it's going to be dark and dungeonous down there, but this light just really kind of plays with that conception. You can see here sectionally where that light floods into the basement. This is a view from the basement looking out. Again, you're more on grade at this point with, you are on grade with the pool deck and the outdoor living, but also more on grade with the golf course and kind of that public facade. Even in the darkest rooms, meant to kind of tuck away and hide behind, we're bringing in light from the side so that we are experiencing natural daylight in those spaces. This is a view from the golf course, looking back at that house, at the inverse nature of the, the tall facade on the public side or on the private side. And, you can begin to see here that we've created a canvas of simple materials and windows that both let in light, but allow light to play on the building itself. These are a few shots of some of those ways to modulate light, giving protection from the interior throughout the day. And some of the materials, again, that begin to pick up the shadows depending on the time of day, the season. This final image from the back of the building, I think really highlights that this building is something that receives light, it takes in light, and that changes throughout the season, throughout the day. The owners as they move through the house throughout those times of day.
And it once again fits into this larger approach that we bring to each house that has to do with that notion of considering form and overall site configuration, as well as considering the individual experience and the sequencing and procession through a given house that also relates to our larger body of work, where the premise is always about thinking simultaneously about form and experience and efficiency all at once. And all those things converge at the inverse house. And we're just excited to share this with you all today. And thank you for hearing us out.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that with us. It was wonderful to see how you generally approach a project and then how that plays out in the specific project. And then taking us back to those basics, I kind of forget all of the existing landscape and the buildings that shape how we design our future buildings, right? So it's good to take a look back at some Corbusier and Kahn and see how that relates to the houses in our own neighborhoods. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A, and audience, keep adding more. So first question was about the guardrail at the Outlar clerestory. I want to say that means living room, facing the golf course. Is there a secret terrace? So it looks like you can see it there.
Yeah, that's a fair question. If we can actually go down to that slide and show that. Yeah, it's actually really meant to be a bit of a gesture toward dappling the light a bit. And then it just is attempting to stay fairly consistent with the language of the other metal work throughout the house. And so no, it isn't about, so to answer that question directly, it isn't about there being another hidden terrace up there, but it's rather a way to be able to cast shadows and to be able to just slightly break up that morning light. And there we can see it there. So and again, just being in a similar language to the rest of the rest of the steel work throughout the house.
Yeah, good eye. I didn't see that, but you can see how it's casting that shadow on that wall. That's great. Second question, what's the approximate price per square foot for a project like this, more specifically this project?
Yeah, that's always a difficult question to answer, just due to plenty of different variables. And it's also a little bit different when this house having started construction a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and as prices have spiked. But this house would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 to $500 a square foot when it was built, and would now be clearly a notch higher than that due to the current supply chain constraints and material costs, increasing labor shortages and different types of things. So we would expect it to be another bracket above that if we were to rebuild starting today. But that's basically the answer for that.
Yeah, and just a side note to that, that's a huge part of designing a project. And I mean, it always has been, but nowadays, especially with that market fluctuation. And, we really encourage our clients to engage a general contractor fairly early on in the process, really towards the end of schematic design, and just to start having those conversations and to start putting as real a number as possible to those design strategies. And so, early on, we look at precedents like this project. A client may say, I love this. And we kind of talk to them about how this might fit into their budget or might not. But then really, the person that's holding all the answers with the numbers is that general contractor. So, we like to have them as part of the team and engaging with the team throughout design.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, next question. Do the owners have a particularly favorite space inside the home?
Yeah,
maybe something during design that they really cherished.
Yeah, that's a great question. The owners have gone out of their way to say how much they really enjoy even very simple things, such as just waking up in the morning and moving from the owner suite and coming out to that main area. Just that experience every day and having that moment of, as they've said, they sort of just pinch themselves every morning. They're excited to be there. I think it has a lot to do with that procession from just the daily ritual of waking up and moving through the cycles of the different daily routines, which relates, of course, to the bedroom component, as well as and its relationship to the courtyard and outdoors, and then the main area, and then descending down. And they also really appreciate being on the golf course. They're golfers themselves, and so I think it's really a series of things that they enjoy that mostly have to do with that eastern portion of the house and how it opens up in that direction.
So rather
Yeah.
than one individual space, it's how the spaces come together to create an experience.
Yes, and I think what's interesting about this house is you may have noticed in the virtual tour in person, each of the family members kind of has their own space. You know, the wife, the Leah's space is this pink room up front, and that's where she offices and her lounge. There's kind of this man cave down below. It's like a deep green and kind of buried with really masculine furniture, you know, for the husband, and then the kids kind of have the whole downstairs domain. So they each have their own spaces that kind of fit their personality and fit, you know, a way for them to go be alone and have their space, but then they all kind of come together in these big open spaces where they can live kind of amongst the landscape. So I think that's also a unique part of this project.
That's awesome. And not something that we would know just from looking at the photos. So it's great to hear those little tidbits. So the rear terrace facing the course is perfect with program areas, etc. How big is the pool? It seemed a bit bigger than a cocktail pool. And is the coping / deck concrete with a special finish? And somebody also asked if you could share the concrete mix used for the pool level. And they said it's quite lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, pools are always challenging, especially on a site that's this tight. And it was important for the owners to have some sort of kind of water place to kind of dip themselves into. And so we were talking about this yesterday on site. We don't know the exact dimensions, but we're assuming that this is about 10 feet wide by 20 foot long. It does include a hot tub at the end closest to us now. So it is really a small pool. The concrete, what we call them lily pads, those were designed or constructed by the same person that did the steps at the entry, that also did the fireplace mantle. So those were really crisp and clean, and a big part of kind of how to transition from the hardscape to the pool and to the hot tub. I'm not sure exactly what the concrete mix was for that, but they were very calibrated, poured offsite and then brought in place.
Okay, and then the light is ever changing. Does the design try to optimize a certain time of the day to create the intended experience? And how is that experience during a different time of the day?
Yeah, it's that's a good question, and we have very specific openings on each orientation that are able to bring in indirect light. And so what that effectively does is it allows for, in different times of the day, certain spaces are activated with more or less direct and indirect light. So this is the east elevation that we're looking at here. And we have the most openings to the east, which of course complements the views as well. But then on each of the other facades, all of which have a challenge of compromising privacy, there are either skylights or clear story windows, or a combination of the two. As the sun moves throughout the day, it activates those different zones. And so and the same thing goes for throughout the seasons. And so as during the summer, the skylights are activated a bit more and allow the light to rake down that stairwell, for example. And then I'm just going to try to find that. Yeah, exactly. This is a little bit, so you can see how that changes a little bit throughout the seasons. But the overall intent is to allow for some variety and diversity of different types of light that's ever changing by opening up in each of the different directions, partly to do with function and partly to do with experience.
So not so much a specific optimal time to experience the light in this house as it's the experience is how it changes. That was more the point.
Correct.
Who is the metal and railing contractor and the pool builder?
Gosh, Austin Iron did all of the structural and architectural steel. So they had a big part in this house. And then the pool contractor, I'm sorry, I don't want to misspeak. I think I know it, but I'm not quite sure. So if that's really important, send us an email and we'll get that information for you.
Fair enough. So that's a comment says that's a really interesting point about engaging a GC at the end of schematic design. Do you always work with the same GC, or how do you make that decision between different GCs so early on?
Yeah, we certainly have worked with many talented GCs, and honestly, there's kind of a right GC for the right client and the right project. And so we work with quite a few. Melody was fantastic to work with and would always be kind of in that list that we give our clients. Ultimately, it is the owner's decision. And so, we don't want to dictate that too much. So we typically give our clients a short list of contractors that we think are appropriate for the scale of project, the budget of the project, the location of the project. And we let them go interview those contractors on their own. We provide kind of a list of questions that we find helpful, and let them really go have that conversation. Ultimately, we tell our clients that, finding a GC is finding someone that you can have a relationship with and that you can trust. Any GC that we would give would be qualified of building a sound home. And really, cost, we're seeing costs come in the same from all of that kind of that tier of GC that works within that price range. So it's not necessarily finding one GC that's going to give you a cheaper price than the other. It's really finding someone that you can have a relationship with and have hard conversations with, and really start, it is a journey. I think Melody, Bernie the other day was talking about this as a journey, and it really is. And so really that's true of your architect, your contractor, your interior designer, any person that's on your team. We're kind of all signing up to be on this journey together and to go through difficult conversations and, wonderful moments. And so that's more what we recommend our clients find when they're looking for a GC. And for that reason, we don't have one single GC that we work with.
Yeah, things pop up during construction, during design, and it's important to be able to trust that that person's telling you the truth, giving you the best options. They, helps if they kind of think similarly in the sense of like, yeah, that is what I would want that solution to be. Thank you for
Absolutely.
having my back on that. So
Yes.
it's great to see what the architect's relationship is with that too. How is rain in the master patio handled with that enclosed space?
We have, as you can see there, we have a wood deck. So actually all the water drains below that, and then we have drainage that takes the water outside of that there.
Yeah, that's the exterior. This is the exterior facade here. So it works. It's able to drain directly out exteriorly from that point. So it has to be. That's an example of something that we work through with the GC, where we have drawings of how we generally intend something to work, but then during construction administration, where we're all figuring out exactly how things will work and the means and methods to do it. That's a perfect example of making sure that works right, so that we're able to capture both the overall composition and form and experience of the space, but then the performance in terms of the building performance to be able to function properly as a sound building as well.
This next one has two questions, so I'll ask the first one first and then follow up the second one. Did your clients request specific elements that you incorporated into the design of the house?
I think, Matt may have a different answer, but I think one thing to note when they came to us, they had been they'd been through the home building process before. And so they had been living in a pretty traditional home. And, also Leah is a realtor, and so very familiar with architecture and different types of architecture. And I think she was more drawn to something that was more modern, cleaner. And her husband, Chris, was, wanted something a little more traditional and was a little hesitant to go too stark and too modern. And so really this house was a combination of both of their, desires and how to create something that was clean and crisp and modern, but also felt warm and inviting and felt like a home. And so that was a big, that's kind of what we kicked off the project with. I don't know if you have any.
No, that's a great way to summarize a lot of the discussions had to do with capturing both of those interests. Go ahead, Pooja, go to the second part of the question.
Oh yeah. What sustainability materials were incorporated into this house?
Yeah, in terms of when we think about sustainability, it really has to do with a holistic approach, and part of that having to do with just the very literal sense of thinking about sustaining. What does it mean for something to endure or sustain? And so when we're thinking about materials, both for exterior materials, whether it has to do with the metal siding or the stucco and the way that stucco is detailed, and the joints for those types of things, or all of the interior materials, deck surfaces, those types of things. We're thinking about how can this building endure and be relatively low maintenance and therefore sustain. And so it's thought of more in that respect rather than, for example, choosing a very specific recycled material in a specific location. It's rather making a robust a robust and durable shell and an interior fit out. And our owners also have 2 teenage boys that are quite active, and so it needed to be able to manage a fair amount of wear and tear as well. And so a lot of the choices had to do with thinking very specifically about how does this work as an overall envelope, in terms of course, managing things like water and everything else, but then also how can this really withstand the test of time?
I'll say too that, this project started out as a remodel, but very quickly went to almost completely new construction, because as we began to dig into some of these walls, they just, even kind of the layers of cladding and sheathing and insulation just were not up to par. And so, both because of Melody and, our desire, but also the client's desire to have a well-built shell, a lot of that came out, and we put stone cladding back in its place. But we just wanted, if we were going to that extent, we really wanted a building that performed well all the way around.
Is that generally how your firm approaches sustainability, is to think about how it can endure and that envelope strategy?
It's a great question, and that's one of the layers, but there are many others. So for example, in this one, working with trees instead of against trees, how do we think about the site as it exists, what the assets are, what the opportunities are on the given site? How do we work with slope rather than against it? And then solar orientation of how we're placing the massing itself, how we're setting up, how we're optimizing efficiency in terms of the functional flow and those types of things. And so it has to do with a lot of things, but one of those being the geometry of the shell and their detailing and specifications of the shell to be able to sustain over time.
We certainly have conversations with clients about, kind of the additive strategies like water collection and PV panels and solar roofs and that sort of thing. And, we love to have those conversations. We love to integrate those things, but it's not a fit for every project and for every budget. And, we want to make sure that we're taking care to have things that can't get VE'd out. So in the end, we want to build in and bake in that kind of sustainable strategy that, deals with site orientation and with kind of the natural shading elements that were given on the site, so that if, all else fails and, the budget is just tight at the end, we don't lose all of our sustainable strategies.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm definitely trained in that passive strategy approach too, but I've never thought of it as like, well, at minimum, we have this going for sustainability, right? And if maybe your client's not into those add-on kind of things, you're like, I'm going to sneak this in. They're not going to like, it's still going to be a sustainable building.
I was going to say too, we also have clients that aren't necessarily all about sustainable approach, and they're not necessarily willing to pay for those or have those integrated. And this is kind of a way that we can sneak that in. Just good building design at its very minimum takes into account those, passive design strategies.
Definitely agreed. So next question, did you have impervious cover challenges with this site? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I would say in general, the impervious cover is and the impervious cover percentage is always a challenge. And it's something similar to what Sarah was describing in terms of the natural flow of the phases, and when we begin to make certain decisions, including when a GC comes on board, those types of things. The those types of challenges are something we confront in the very beginning when we're thinking about site strategy and site plan and overall configuration. And so it certainly was a challenge, as it is for a lot of our projects, but one that we were able to easily integrate into the entire design without it becoming a compromise later. If instead we had cooked up a scheme that we liked a lot in theory without having run the numbers, there could be some disappointment there. But instead, if we know what those numbers are from the very outset, know what those constraints are, and then work around them. So the same thing with the HOA that Sarah described very well, that on either side of this building of our house, we knew we had to have almost completely solid facades and that almost row house typology. It's a similar thing where instead of seeing that as a compromise that diluted our scheme, we just confronted that from the very beginning and allowed the design to integrate and absorb that.
We were also able to work off, with this having an existing building on it, we were able to use that as kind of a benchmark and claim the hardscape and the built surface of that. And, these homes are very unique. This is like, we keep referring to this row house, this HOA. These are very tight properties, and you can't really see the neighbors now, but in almost all cases, those buildings kind of max out the property. And so there's a little bit of green space in the front, but really these are that's helpful. These are pretty tight properties where the building takes up most of the property and really opens up to that golf course. And, when we were touring this yesterday in person, we kept having people stand in the living room thinking that this whole backyard, our client's backyard extended, beyond, and we're like, oh, no, it ends right here. And this is the public golf course. But that's the benefit of these homes. And that's they're giving up their yard space to be on the golf course and have that extension into that public space.
That is a very helpful photo when you're explaining that the walls, you don't want to look into your neighbors. I was like, how close are these houses? And yeah, you would be looking right at your neighbor.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually on one side, the neighbor is about 5 feet away on this side, but on this side is a little more of a gap, but that's for a driveway. It's effectively an alley that slopes up, but in either case, we were constrained to having very minimal openings on either of those sides.
So the next question is, what was the biggest design trade-off you had to make and the one you'd be most curious about trying out in an alternate universe? So maybe there was something early on in the process that y'all were planning on having, and then as we talked about, the design is always changing, maybe in construction administration or in the design process itself.
Yeah, I don't have a specific instance. That's a great question. There's certainly, through every project, there is a lot of people call it VE, value engineering. We like to think of it more as just refinement of the project. And I think for this project, there were certainly rounds of that, many rounds of kind of how do we find where there's the most value and cut things that aren't, contributing as much to the goal of the project. And, it was so great working with Melody and with Lindsay and with our clients that it really was a refinement and a distillation of the project. And I am having a hard time putting my finger on exactly what we lost that seems like it's missing now. I don't know if you.
Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it, Sarah. I would say one example of something that evolved, I'll even call it evolving more than a compromise, is we at one point had banquette seating for this gap. You can somewhat see there's that gap that pulls away that allows that staircase to wrap around. And so just to show a few views of that dining area is just back here. In an earlier version of the scheme, that was a sort of a bench, sort of a built-in bench that would be banquette seating for the dining area, which we thought could be interesting instead of having a railing to be able to just allow that bench component to cap the edge. And getting into the design and getting into some decisions about where to invest the money, the budget, that was the decision was to not go forward with that. And that's an example of one that it would have been nice to see what that might have been, but ultimately confronting that in the design process and embracing it and allowing it to feel as though it works with what's happening outside is one that would be interesting to imagine what that would have been like, but it doesn't feel as though that was it was a miss or something that we would regret doing. But it is an example of the way that question was structured, of something that is fun to try on different projects in the future. There'll be opportunities to try different things like that. But part of that whole VE process is about determining priorities and what are our priorities, and how do we therefore continue with the design process to emphasize some priorities more than other things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Next question. Could you share the honed concrete finish on the floors for the living space on the pool level, how you got to that finish? So I didn't notice that myself. Is it concrete on the lower level, or is it the same wood floor?
Yes, it's concrete. And since this was an existing slab, there was a slab there, but that slab was very irregular. It had a lot of slope to it, and it was not a flat surface. And so effectively what was done was a topping slab was created, which is really a thinner layer of concrete. The structural slab is still down below, the structural foundation is still below, and then a topping slab is placed on top of that with a fairly neutral color to that, and then it was just sealed on top. There was no stain applied. So there are different ways to apply stains or colors and integrate that within the mix or after the fact. But in this case, it was a topping slab partially to level it all out, and then also to be able to control a little bit of the finish of what that would be. Since it previously, in the previous version of the house, there had been carpet below. It wasn't ever meant to be exposed below. So not only was it irregular in terms of its geometry, but also it just wasn't a sort of a presentable finish. And so that topping slab allowed both of those to be achieved and flush out and have a tight fit for the doors and the windows in terms of insulation and those types of things.
Great. Next question. Let's see. How do you prepare each client for the design process journey? Do you have a methodology for getting them on board?
We, we find that it varies. We really enjoy the relationship with clients, and it is very much that. As Sarah said, the same way Sarah described how that works for a GC. How when a client chooses a GC, they want to choose someone that they think they can have a productive relationship with. We recommend the same thing for a client when choosing an architect, choosing someone that they think that they can have a relationship and communicate well and effectively with each other, and that they can feel they can be heard, and will also then receive expertise in return. And so it varies a bit, but one of the things that a bit of this presentation showed, the video showed, is that we try to pair the larger ideas of what we're doing with the effect of what that means. In other words, we're not interested in trying to just sell a client on a scheme and saying, here's your masterpiece, you're welcome, but rather saying, here's the approach we have, and here's why we're doing what we're doing. We might have a couple of different options we'll show to say, we've thought about doing it this way or this way, and we think that either of these could be quite successful directions. Which of these resonate with you more and why? And let's discuss that. And so it's less of us trying to get the client on board with our scheme that we're trying to sell to them, but rather that we have a couple of ideas that we're excited about and we want to share and then develop it in tandem. And certainly some clients respond more to certain types of drawings and certain representations than others, and we try to dial that in. And the same thing in terms of that's the case from the very beginning of the process all the way through during construction. Some clients are more involved in construction and some a little bit less. There's always some involvement, but we try to tailor that to what it makes sense for any given client. But it usually is a combination of drawings and floor plans and other types of representation that becomes more experiential.
Also, when we're interviewing with clients, of course, we talk about our work, and we make it clear that we are modernists, and we approach design with that that importance and that in mind. But we also try, like Matt was saying, when we're looking at these kind of finished photos of a project, we always are trying to help them understand that it's rooted back to an idea, to a thesis. There is a reason for that. We're not just in the business of creating one style of home, or, hey, we can stamp this out on a new site for you. But really getting clients to understand our process, and that, a lot of our projects look very different. And that's because we have different clients and different sites, different contractors. And, we're really trying to create something special and very specific for each client. And so, it's hopefully you like our work and you've come to us because you like that, but we also want to sell you on the idea that this is a process and this is something that we're going to create and unfold with you. And we have no idea what this will look like in the end. And that's very exciting for us. And so, I would say when we're talking to people about how to work with us and the people that work best with us, it's kind of trusting us to this process, this unknown that will come in the end, and how all of these previous works come from that same process and from that same approach.
I want to keep talking to y'all about everything you just said, but I'll keep us going, get a couple more questions in here. So one was, do you have a picture of the original home that you would be willing to share? And
yeah, it's a great
if you
question.
if you do, I can ask the next questions while you pull it up, but.
We actually don't in this file. I'll take this opportunity to plug Meldy once again. So the GC's Meldy, they have both videos and photos where they've done some incredible time-lapse photography, sort of showing the before and after in a dynamic sort of moving footage. That I would recommend looking at. If you just look at search Meldy Inverse House, that would be a great other perspective to see the GC's perspective and sharing some of their process. Was what I'd recommend for that. But I will just say really briefly that it looked very comparable to these two houses on either side. They were all from the same vintage, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s development that popped up at a similar time. So it wasn't identical to either of those, but a little more similar in terms of the vintage.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of summarize this group of questions that this person was asking as our last question is, how did you approach the decision to not remodel the house, or, what was the intention with trying to just remodel it first and not do a complete new build? I'll just read their whole question. In a project like this, where it seems like a complete new construction, is it better to just tear down? Is there a significant construction cost difference, or can a traditional home be transformed both internally and externally to a modern home like this?
That's a really good question. And it's one that is definitely not have a black and white answer. There's definitely not binaries there. I'll first just say that in any project that we approach, that we take on, we try to have an open mind in terms of what the best approach might be in every way. We don't want to go in with assumptions, sort of assuming, oh, we're definitely going to preserve what's there at all costs, or that we're definitely going to scrape the lot at all costs. We try to go in with an open mind and evaluate the conditions the best that we can ourselves, and likewise, if to get feedback from other consultants or GCs. But quite often it's a process to arrive at that. It's not very obvious in the beginning, and it takes a little bit of digging in, and sometimes literally digging in, like opening walls, you have to sort of sometimes really get in. It's more than what a building inspector would do, for example. It's like really carving into this and seeing what you actually have to be able to make that determination. And ultimately, a decision is really made with the client, with the GC, with the structural engineer. And often it begins to become apparent after you wade into that process a bit, especially with the structural engineer. If the structural engineer deems that what's there is not suitable structurally to endure the test of time, that it's close to failing, it needs to be rebuilt, whether that's to do with the roof or the exterior walls, especially if some of the interior walls, we've seen many instances of mold or other lacking of waterproofing barriers or insulations or things that just make a responsible, thermally efficient building. Depending on what we find in those instances and in conversation with others, we try to make that decision all together. And there are just pros and cons in each instance. Sometimes there is some specific character that the initial house will have that's worth trying to preserve. And sometimes it's an heirloom of the owner, and we want to go further. And I just want to highlight that sometimes that remodel process can be much more expensive than a rebuild, and that might be worth it to a certain owner, or it might not to others. We've had clients that have had, and it's an undue burden to do with the upkeep cost they're constantly paying to patch things all the time. That ultimately becomes less sustainable because they're spending so much and just constantly repairing things where it makes sense to rebuild. And so it is something that we do take seriously and try to think through carefully and try to have a decision that makes the best sense for a given owner. But it's absolutely not a matter of going into every project with a predetermined notion.
Well, it's been great hearing how y'all made those decisions, what kind of informed those thoughts, and seeing this great design through your eyes. So thank you for having all of us get here for your presentation. That's our time for the day. So everyone who's watching, I hope you'll join me again at 1 p.m. for the Clark Richardson Ramsey residence. And that's it. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.